We're holding at the Mishnah on Hey Amud Aleph, new Mishnah, and we're going to discuss, you see Hey Amud Aleph, 5a. Hey Amud Aleph, 5a.
Thank you.
New Mishnah. We're going to have today 3 sections in our learning.
Mishnah?
Ezat Hashem at the Mishnah, yeah.
Oh, the Mishnah.
Well, the first section we'll deal with is there are certain situations when an event falls out on Shabbat that we push it forward. It's nidche, which we push forward actually, the event. And we'll get to that in the Mishnah. And we'll explain these events in the Gemara, amongst other things. Then we'll have a Braita, which is regarding the Korban Chagiga we'll have to analyze. And finally we'll have a Psak relating to 3 behaviors of Rebbi that will actually lead us into tomorrow as well. We'll get to that later. So just to recap for a minute where we're up to here regarding these Kfarim. We have said until now that there's 3 types of cities. There's the unwalled, the walled, and then villagers. The villagers are the primary example in general when you would push the reading back. Meaning even though they really should read the Megilla on the 14th because essentially they're unwalled cities, but in certain scenarios where the Yom HaKnisa, Monday or Thursday, is earlier than that, on the 11th, 12th, or 13th, they could read the Megillah earlier. That's what we have said. The idea, though, that we see from that is that the Megillah, when it's on, let's say 14th is Tuesday, so they'll push it back to Monday. They'll read Megillah on Monday. The Mishnah is going to contrast that with certain things that if it falls out on Shabbat, for example, that you don't push it backwards, but you push it forwards. It means regarding reading the Megillah, the leniency is to make it earlier. Makdimin, to make it earlier. Regarding these events we're going to list in the Mishnah, there's actually the idea of pushing forward, making it later, not earlier. So let's see the Mishnah. Now the Mishnah begins with a rule that we've already mentioned. What is the definition of a large city? Right? So we said if it's a large city, you read on the 14th. If it's a village, you have the leniency to read earlier. So what is the definition of a large city? Kol sheyesh ba 10 batlanin, any city that has 10 batlanin. We've mentioned this before. Batlanin does not mean people that don't do anything. It means idle people that are supported by the tzibur. They don't work, but they're paid by the tzibur to always be in the Beit HaKnesset, so that there's always going to be a minyan when it comes to Shachrit, Mincha, and Arvit. There's always going to be a minyan. A little bit like a kolel. Pachot mikan arei ze kfar. If they have less than this, so that would be deemed a village, and you'd have the leniencies that come along with the village, like we've spoken out. If I remember correctly, I believe there's a Meiri who comments on this and explains this number 10 not only comes from the idea of a minyan, but each one had a special job. One was Balkoreh, one was, I forgot, he goes on and explains. The treasurer, I don't remember exactly. There was a certain cheshbon that he had that the 10 people comprised of the 10 people necessary to run a shul, basically. Very interesting idea. I remember correctly, he says something like that. Now, when it comes to reading Megillah, you have the ability to read earlier but not later, which means you never push off forward. That's not a concept that we find. Aval, but when it comes to the next event, we're going to make it later and not earlier. So let's go through them. Number 1, zman atzei kohanim v'ha'am, the Bach adds in v'ha'am. The time of the wood of the kohanim and the nation. So Rashi explains based on a Gemara Masechet Ta'anit that what happened was when the Jewish people came back from Persia after the Purim story, there was a shortage of, they were poor, they didn't have money. So there was a shortage of wood in the Beit HaMikdash to use on the Mizbeach. So a few families dedicated from themselves to bring wood to use as fuel on the Mizbeach, and it became kavua that those families would continue perpetually to bring wood on certain days, and it became a Yom Tov for them on those days. Meaning it was like established for future generations based on the good deeds that they had done before. Those families would have a special day throughout moving forward to be able to bring korbanot and wood on those days that would be determined for them. Now, if that day that they were meant to have their minor festival that they would have fell out on Shabbat, so they can't do this. So in such a scenario, what they're going to do is push it off to Sunday. Not back to Friday, but push it off to Sunday. The Tisha B'Av, as well as Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbat, you push it off to Sunday. You don't make it back on Friday, and Rashi adds, actually, it's the same thing with the other fast days. Shavasa B'Tammuz, Asara B'Tevet. The other fast days is the same rule. It only chose Tisha B'Av in the Mishnah, because as the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah tells us, Hochbelu Bo Tzarot. Tisha B'Av had a multitude of tragedies. So it's using it as the primary example, but the other ones are the same, it would go off to Sunday as well. chagiga, now as well as the korban chagiga.
What does Rashi say about Tisha B'Av?
Meaning the Mishnah is just using it as the primary example. But the other fast days are the same. If they fall out on Shabbat, you push it off to Sunday.
You push it on Sunday and not Friday. Why? Is the question.
See in the Gemara. No. I'm just telling you why it uses to Shabbat. The Gemara will explain to us exactly what's the purpose of right, exactly.
Maybe,
what's the purpose of pushing these to Sunday and not Friday, right?
Maybe because Mashiach can come and then there is no Tisha B'Av or something.
Halavai. The Gemara is going to say, let's see. We'll see today. Chagiga. Now, as well as Chagiga, on Yom Tov, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, there was a mitzvah to bring certain korbanot. One of those korbanot was called Shalmei Chagiga. It was actually Olat Re'iyah, Korban Olah, that was meant to be brought in the Beit HaMikdash. And also you would bring Shalmei Chagiga, which is a shlamim that was a Chagiga. Chagiga is a celebratory offering. That's what it was. Now, if Shabbat was the first day of Sukkot or the first day of Pesach, for example, you can't bring Shalmei Chagiga on Shabbat. So they would push it off to bring it on Sunday. Now, in the case of Sukkot and Pesach, that's fine because you have more than one day of the festival. Shavuot is going to be something interesting. We'll get to that in the Gemara as well. But anyways, the point is you push it off to Sunday and not Friday. And finally, v'hakel, regarding hakel. In all these cases, ma'acharin velo makdimin. You push it off to Sunday and not make it earlier to Friday. Now, what is hakel? So hakel is after every Shemitah year, which means the 8th year, really. When there's a 70-year Shemitah and the 8th year on Sukkot, they would have a special program where all the Jews would gather in the Beit HaMikdash and the king would read certain parshiot from the Torah to inspire the people. It was a very special occasion because even the children participated. It says, Anashim, Nashim, V'taf. Even the children, even the little children were involved. Now, this could not be performed on Shabbat. So if that day fell out to be Shabbat, they'd have to push it off to the next day. Why couldn't it be performed on Shabbat? So Rashi quotes Gemara Yerushalmi that says, because in order to do this, they had to build a bima, a platform out of wood. They couldn't build it on Shabbat for the king to stand on. Therefore, they push it off to Sunday. The Gemara there addresses, why not build it on Friday? So the Gemara says, because if you build it on Friday, it would cramp the Azara for the whole day, meaning it would cause it to become very crowded in the Azara. That would be a problem. So they could only build it on the day they used it. Mela, they would do it on Sunday, not on Shabbat. These are scenarios you push forward, not backwards. Fine. Continues the Mishnah. Some take out those words, but even though when it comes to reading the Megillah, we said you could read earlier. So for example, if Shabbat is the 14th, so you push it back to Thursday for the Kfarim, for example. So even though that's true, but nonetheless, mutarin behespid uvetanit uvmatanot le'evyonim. The day earlier that you're reading doesn't have the full qualification of Purim. So if you're reading on the 11th, 12th, or 13th, halachically you're allowed to, but you're still allowed to do hesped and ta'anit, which is eulogies and fasting, which you're not usually allowed to do on a Yom Tov, on a festival, since it doesn't have full qualifications of Purim, other than reading the Megillah, and I guess also matanot le'evyonim, and you give the gifts to the poor. So there's a uniqueness on these days is that it's a festival that you read the Megillah, you give matanot le'evyonim, but it's not asur in eulogies and fasting, like usually a Yom Tov would be. Still, you're allowed to do those things. Now, this is Rabbi Yehuda we quoted earlier. Rabbi Yehuda says, Matai, when do the villagers have this leniency to read Megillah earlier? It's when they go into the large cities on Monday and Thursday. But if they were not entering anyways on Monday and Thursday, they'd only be allowed to read the Megillah in its time, which means on the 14th. They wouldn't have this leniency to read earlier. They'd read on the 14th with everyone else, with all the other unwalled cities in such a scenario. Let's start the Gemara. The Gemara tells us, Tana. The Braita explains, who are these 10 batlanin that we're talking about that make a city into a ir gdola, a large city and not a village? Asara batlanin shebebeit hakneset. It means the 10 idle people of the shul, of the Beit HaKnesset. It's not just 10 people sitting on the street. We're talking about 10 people that were there, supported by the tzibur, so there was always a minyan. So the Gemara says, in these scenarios, you read earlier, meaning you read Megillah earlier, if for whatever reason you needed to push it back, but you wouldn't push it forward beyond the 14th. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Why is it that we're comfortable pushing Megillah back, but not forward? Where does that come from? So Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra, V'lo ya'avor. The pasuk says, it shall not pass. Now it's a little bit taken out of context, because contextually means this mitzvah will never pass from the Jewish people. It means we'll always continue to keep this mitzvah, Purim, Megillah, etc. But the way we're explaining it in Drush is, V'lo ya'avor, you don't go beyond. That's the way we're understanding it. Don't pass beyond the day, but rather go back if you need to. Now the Gemara quotes a couple of drashot, it starts with the same Amorah. That's why it's quoted here. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, very interesting in terms of determining the calendar. Minayin she'en monin yamim l'shanim. How do we know that you don't determine a year by days? So we know that a solar year is 365 days, meaning a calendar determined by the sun, roughly 365 days. The lunar year is roughly 354 days. I say roughly because it's not exact, but roughly 354 days. So how do we know that a Jewish year is not determined by days, meaning 354 days for that matter, or 365, but rather it's determined by the months. Actually, it's determined by the months. Shene'emar, as the pasuk tells us, this is in Parashat Bo, L'chodshei Hashana. It says the months of the year, which means the year is determined by the months, not by the days. So Rashi says, L'may nafka mina, meaning what are we talking about here? So the scenario, Rashi gives an example. If somebody was standing on, it was Aleph Nisan, and he said, for the next year I'll be prohibited, he made a neder, I'm going to be asur in drinking wine for this year, for this year. So now, the determination of the year is when Aleph Nisan of the next year rolls around, regardless how many days that is. Maybe it's a leap year, so you have an extra month. Maybe some of the months that year were shorter because it was 30 and not 30 but 29. The determination is not by days, the determination is based on the months. And therefore, when you get to Aleph Nisan of the next year, that would be considered a full year, not based on the number of days that it was. Continues the Gemara, a similar idea. Chadashim, sorry, just finish up. Chadashim atamoneh l'shanim, that you calculate a year by the months. V'yatamoneh yamim l'shanim, you don't calculate a year by its days. Rabbanan de Kisri mishum Rabbi Abba Amr, the Rabbanan of Kisri, Kisaria, in the name of Rabbi Abba, said a similar idea, which is minayin she'en mechashvin sha'ot l'chodashim. How do we know that we don't calculate a month by the hours? Actually, a full cycle of the moon is roughly 29 and a half days. Problem is, you can't have 29 and a half day month. It doesn't make sense practically. So sometimes the Chachamim say it's 29 days, and sometimes they say the month is 30 days. So the point is, how do we know that it's not determined by the hours, which is not 29 and a half, but rather it's either 29 or 30. It's determined by days, not by hours. Shene'emar, as the pasuk in Parashat Ba'alotecha says, Ad chodesh yamim, till a month of days. A month of days, right? That's talking about the slav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that the Jews are going to receive these fatty birds called the slav. What's it translated as in English? The slav is translated as, I forgot what it's called. In English, there's a word for it, the slav. It was the fatty bird that when the Jews were complaining about meat, they want meat, Hashem said he's going to send them this bird. It said, I'll send you for a month of days. Interesting. So yamim ata mechashev l'chodashim. The point is that you calculate a month by the days, v'i ata mechashev sha'ot l'chodashim, and not by the hours. So Rashi says again, l'may nafka mina. What is the importance of knowing that a month is calculated by its days and not by its hours? So he says a very interesting scenario. If somebody gives a get to his wife, and he makes the following condition, he says the get should take effect if I don't come back by the end of the month. That's what he says. So if it's a 29-day month and he comes back 29 and a half days later, so you might say, look, in terms of the lunar following of the moon around, it's not yet a full cycle. No, but since it's a 29-day month, you've already lost your opportunity because it's already considered the end of the month. You don't calculate a month by the hours, but rather by the days. Let's continue. All of these events we said in the Mishnah, you'll push forward, but not backwards. So let's go through them. What's the reasoning? Tisha B'Av, what's the reason Tisha B'Av is pushed forward and not back to Friday? Because Akdume Poranut Lo Mekadmi. We don't want to make tragedies earlier. Tisha B'Av, and also the other fast days for that matter, are a remembrance of sad times, of tragedies. Destruction of the temple, for example. We don't want to make that earlier. We'd rather push that off if we could, not make that an earlier commemoration. Chagiga ve'akel. Now these also, it's logical. When you bring the korban chagiga, if it's Shabbat, you'll push it off to Sunday. And also Hakel, the event of Hakel, you'll push it off to Sunday. Mishum da'akati lo mata zman chiyuvayu, because the time of the obligation has not yet come. Right? You can't bring a korban for Sukkot if it's not yet Sukkot. So if Sukkot begins on Shabbat, the first opportunity that you have to do it is going to be Sunday. You can't do it on Friday. It's not yet Sukkot. If Hakel falls out on Shabbat, you can't do it you do it on Sunday. Right? Logical. Now, let's move on now to the second section. This Braita says a very vague terminology.
So it's like two reasons then for
Shabbat. Oh, for Hakel.
Also, right? Because of the platform you cannot build on Shabbat, and because you are not going to do it before the time it releases.
Well, you can't do it on Shabbat. All of these you can't do on Shabbat. The question is, would you push it forward or backwards? That's the question. All of them, there's differing issues. Like Hakel, you can't build the bima, that platform. Tisha B'Av, you can't keep. It's an issue.
Okay, but the reason you push it
pushing forward
because it's not yet the time.
Exactly, the time has not yet come.
It's like you make Pesach earlier.
Exactly, it doesn't work. There's no fulfillment there. Exactly. Let's continue. Now the Braita says a vague terminology. We'll have three ways of explaining this Braita. Let's see. Tana, the Braita says as follows: chagiga v'chol zman chagiga me'acharin. Chagiga. Now again, chagiga refers to shalmei chagiga. It's a special korban shlamim that the Jews would bring on the chagim, on the festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And then it says in the Braita, v'kol zman chagiga, so that offering, the shalmei chagiga, and the whole time of the chagiga, ma'acharin, you push forward. So the Gemara says, what does this mean? Bishlama chagiga, I understand the first part of this Braita, Te'i mikla b'shabata ma'acharin anla, lebatar shabata, like we just said, that if the first day of Sukkot is Shabbat, you'll push off this sacrificing of the Shalmei Chagiga to Sunday. So I understand Ma'acharin, Chagiga is Ma'acharin, is pushed off. We've already explained that. Elazman Chagiga Mahi. But what does it mean? The time of the Chagiga is pushed off. What do you mean the time of the Chagiga is pushed off? So we have three explanations. Amar Rav Oshaya Achika Amar, this is what it means to say in the Braita. Chagiga b'Shabbat, it means like this. If Shabbat is the first day of Sukkot, okay? So now, again, like I told you before, there's actually two korbanot you have to bring. There's really a third, but we're not going to get into Shalmei Simcha. We're not going to talk about that. We learned Masechet Chagiga, we'll get into that. But you bring a Shalmei Chagiga, which is a korban shlamim, and you also bring Olat Riyah, which is a korban Olah. Okay, the distinction halacha, Olah is completely burnt on the Mizbeach, Shlamim is, some of it's burnt on Mizbeach, some is eaten by the owners, etc. There's distinctions in halacha, whatever. The point is as follows, is that the Braita, when it says, I'll just explain this outside and we'll see it inside. It says, chagiga, v'kol zman chagiga me'acharin. So the way we're going to interpret it as follows. Chagiga, the shalmei chagiga, cannot be brought on Shabbat. So if the first day of Sukkot is Shabbat, when are you going to bring it? On the second day of Sukkot, which in the times in the Torah, it's just one day of, you don't have 2 days of Yom Tov, so it was the next day actually. It's Chol HaMoed already. For us to be the third day, whatever. But we don't bring korbanot anyway. The point is, that's me. Chagiga is pushed off means it's not brought on Shabbat, but it could be brought on Yom Tov, or Chol HaMoed for that matter. But what is Zman Chagiga referring to? Is that there's a different korban, which is the Olah, that can't even be brought on Yom Tov, but rather has to be brought on Chol HaMoed. That's what it means. Zman Chagiga, there's a certain korban during the Zman Chagiga, during the time of the festival, that the Shlamim could be brought, but this can't be brought. What does that mean? That the Olah is not only pushed off from Shabbat, but it's also pushed off from Yom Tov to Chol HaMoed. That's the point. You can't even, and this is going to be the opinion of Beit Shammai, as we'll see. It's machloket. So let's see that inside. Achika Amar Chagiga b'Shabbat. The Chagiga will be pushed off. The Shlamim will be pushed off from Shabbat. Ve'olat Riyah. But the Olah, Filu b'Yom Tov, would not even be able to be brought on Yom Tov. You'd have to push it off from Yom Tov and only bring it on Chol HaMoed. Why? Zman Chagiga me'acharin. Because there is a korban that during Zman Chagiga, during the festival, is also pushed off. Is pushed off to the next day. Mani, who is the author then? Beit Shammai, it's the position of Beit Shammai. The Tanan, like the Mishnah in Beit Zat tells us, Beit Shammai, Omrim, Beit Shammai says, Mevi'in shlamim b'Yom Tov. You could bring a korban shlamim on Yom Tov. Ve'en somchin alehen. But you do not do smicha. Before a korban was usually brought, they would lean on the animal. On Yom Tov, you're not allowed to lean on the animal, says Beit Shammai. But you could sacrifice the korban shlamim on Yom Tov. Avolo olot, but you cannot bring korban olot on Yom Tov. You have to push that off to You can't bring it on Yom Tov. You would bring it on Chol HaMoed. That's what we're essentially saying would be the author of this
Ola, you
Breita.
have to kill the animal?
Well, both of them you have to slaughter. The reason Rashi goes through the reasoning is that Ola is not something that you benefit from personally. Ola is completely burnt. So therefore you don't have the same leniency to bring it on Yom Tov like you would shlamim, which you do benefit from. Rashi goes through. Beit Hillel say mevi'in shlamim ve'olot. You could bring shlamim and olot on Yom Tov. V'somchin aleihen. You could also do smicha, lean on them before their sacrifice. That's the first pshat in the Breita. Rava Amar Rava says a second pshat. The way you have to read the two parts of this Breita is as if it's one sentence. This is how you read it. Chagiga. When could the shalmei chagiga be brought? Kol zman chagiga me'acharin. The entire festival, it could be delayed. Meaning to say is that if you didn't bring the shlamim on the first day, bring it the second day. If you didn't bring it the second day, bring it the third day. And there's a chidush in this. Tfelo, but beyond that you cannot. The Tanan, Mishnah Masechet Chagiga teaches us, Mi shelo chag b'yom tov harishon shel chag. If somebody did not bring the shalmei chagiga, that shlamim, on the first day of Sukkot, chogeg ve'olech et kol haregel kulo, he could bring it the entire festival, v'yom tov ha'acharon shel chag, as well as the last day of the festival. Now, what's the last day of the festival of Sukkot? Shmini Atzeret. He could even bring the shlamim of Sukkot on Shmini Atzeret, which is a chidush, because really Shmini Atzeret is considered a separate Yom Tov in certain areas, but in regards to Hashlama making up, you could bring the korban that was meant to be brought on Sukkot on Shmini Atzeret. That's the chidush. Avar regel, but once the festival passes, v'lo chag, if you didn't bring it, eno chayav v'achayuto, you're not responsible in its coverage, and therefore you would not be able to bring it anymore. So that's the second pshat. Chagiga kol zman chagiga me'acharin. You could bring it the whole festival. Rav Ashi Amar Rav Ashi says a third explanation of the Breita. The way you have to read it is as follows: Chagiga v'kol zman chagiga me'acharin. It means any time of festival you could delay. Now the chidush here, as we'll see, is that with Pesach and Sukkot, it's understandable that if you miss the first day, you bring the second day. You miss the second day, you bring the third day. But what happens if Shabbat is Shavuot? Now, we have 2 days, but in Eretz Yisrael it's 1 day. And you have to bring korbanot on Shavuot, but it's Shabbat, you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to, so what do you do now? So the chidush is,
you have 8 days.
There's 7 days of hashlama actually that come to Shavuot as well when it falls out on Shabbat. That's what Rashi explains over here. As we'll see, there is a machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel if Shavuot falls out on Friday, how you should behave. But if Shavuot falls out on Shabbat, they both agree you have 7 days. And the Gemara Masechet Chagiga explains to us how we know that, but it's a major chidush. And that's why actually the days after Shavuot are minor festival days, based on the idea that there was a hashlama, that it was applicable. Let's see. Even with Shavuot, echad yoma me'acharin, which is just 1 day, still you could delay it beyond that. It's not like the Mishnah tells us in Chagiga, Modim Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree, she'im chal atzeret liyot b'Shabbat, if Shavuot fell on Shabbat, she'yom tavuach achar Shabbat, the day of slaughtering the korbanot would be after Shabbat. As Rashi says, you actually have 7 days total in order to bring those korbanot. Okay, let's move on now to the final section here. Amar Rebbi Lazar, Amar Rebbi Chanina. Rebbi Lazar in the name of Rebbi Chanina testified 3 behaviors that Rebbi did. We'll see exactly what the chidushim are in each one. Rebbi natan etiyah Purim. First of all, Rebbi planted a tree on Purim. Now, what's wrong with planting a tree on Purim? Planting a tree on Purim. Would you plant the tree on Purim? Okay, so we're going to see momentarily, well tomorrow actually, we'll get to is, it's not so simple that we're allowed to do melacha on Purim. I never even thought about it because we drive to shul. Of course we do melacha on Purim. Okay, so that's how we paskin. But the point is, there is a tzad to say, there is going to be an option to say, you're actually not allowed to do melacha on Purim. We'll get to that. So the chidush was he planted a tree on Purim. We'll see exactly how he was allowed to and what the issue might be. Turning to Hayamud Bet, v'rachatz bekrona shel tzipuri b'shva asar b'tamuz. Rashi learns, it means he took a shower in the public place during the shuk, while people were around, of tzipuri on the 17th of Tammuz. Now, it doesn't mean he took it publicly with people seeing him, but it meant he did it b'farhestia without hiding the fact that he was washing. So this is also a bit of a chidush, is that there is a chumrah that's applicable to Tisha B'Av. For example, you can't wash, but it's not applicable to the other fast days. So therefore, actually, you're allowed to wash on the other fast days. That seems to be, on Shavasa B'Tammuz, Rebbi was allowed to take a shower. And 3, and this is the biggest chidush l'chora, ubikesh la'akor Tisha B'Av v'lo hodulo. Rebbe wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av. It sounds like to do away with Tisha B'Av, but the Chachamim did not agree with him about that, about doing away with Tisha B'Av. So this is what Rabbi Eliezer testified about, is that Rebbe, the third one was, Rebbe wanted to get rid of Tisha B'Av, and the Chachamim disagreed with him about that. So Amar Lefanov, Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda turned to Rabbi Eliezer and he said, Rebbe lo kach hayamase. That was not the story. Rebbe didn't want to get rid of Tisha B'Av altogether. That's impossible. Ela Tisha B'Av shechal lihiyot b'Shabbat hava. What happened was, that year Tisha B'Av fell out on Shabbat, and v'dachinu lacha Shabbat. They pushed it off to Sunday, which is the halacha. But Amar Rebbe, so Rebbe then said, Ho'il v'nidche, once it was pushed off, yidche. Once it's pushed off, we could already be more lenient on that day. You could push it off because it's already considered a nidche. It's already pushed off, essentially. Okay, so that makes it a little bit better, because at least we're not saying Rebbe just wanted to do away with the Tisha B'Av. That's a very difficult thing to say. But the Chachamim still disagree. They said, no, we keep it on Sunday, the 10th of Av. That's the day meant to be. So Rabbi Eliezer commented when he heard Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda say this, Kari Aleh, he called Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Tovim Ashnayim Mina Echad. The pasuk in Kohelet says, better is 2 than 1. Meaning is, if I didn't have you here, so I would have thought Rebbe wanted to do away with Tisha B'Av. Baruch Hashem, you were here to tell me he didn't want to do away with it. It was a nidche, and he said, okay, once you're lenient, you could be more lenient. Now Tosafot says something very interesting. Just we'll finish off with this. If you look at Tosafot, Ubikesh la'akor Tisha B'Av v'lo hodulo. I want to take a look at that Tosafot. You see the second Tosafot on the page? You see on the right side of the page? Ubikesh la'akor Tisha B'Av v'lo hodulo. Tosafot is bothered. He doesn't understand what was the Hava Amina here? The Hava Amina of the Gemara was he wanted to do away with Tisha B'Av. How could you possibly say there's such a thought even? Rebbe Yehuda Nasi wanted to get rid of Tisha B'Av. It doesn't make sense. So Tosafot says, Kasha, this is difficult. How did it enter your mind? That Rebbe wanted to get rid of Tisha B'Av entirely. And the Gemara in Tani tells us, anybody that eats on Tisha B'Av, he won't experience the comfort of Yerushalayim. Yehuda Nasi didn't want to just get rid of Tisha B'Av. So what's the Hava Amin here? What's the starting point? And furthermore, and this is very interesting, we have a yesod. A later court cannot uproot what an earlier court established unless they're greater in chokhmah and minyan, in intelligence, in wisdom, and number. And Rebbe, his court wasn't greater than the earlier courts that established Tisha B'Av. So how would there even have been a Hava Amina here that he was going to get rid of Tisha B'Av altogether? So the Yesh Shlomai says 2 answers, very interesting answers. Number 1, he says, "Delo ratza le'okro, ela michumra sheyesh bo yoter mishar ta'aniyot." He didn't want to get rid of it. What he wanted to do was to say, earlier generations, they kept Tisha B'Av as well, but they didn't keep it with the stringency that we keep Tisha B'Av. They kept it like the lighter fast days. We keep it with a stringency. You can't wear shoes, can't bathe, can't put on oils, etc. So what he wanted to do was to remove those stringencies, to make it like the other fast days, like those earlier generations. That's
Sunday only.
So it doesn't say clearly, because this isn't the Hava. I mean, maybe on Sunday only, but the point is, right, maybe it's
pushed off.
I don't know. See, Tosafot is not clarifying that. It sounds like maybe even when it's not pushed off. He wanted to say is, there was an earlier generation's leniency in regards to this day, and therefore we should be allowed to reenact that now. Inami, alternatively, yesh lomar deratzela okro mitishi'i ulekav'o ba'asiri. Rebbe wanted to remove it from being on the 9th of Av and to establish it on the 10th of Av. That's what he wanted to do. How do we know that there's such an option? Rabbi Yochanan comments in Masechet Ta'anit, Ilu avayatam, if I would have been there, kav'ate ba'asiri. If I would have been there when they determine which day should be the day we commemorate the Churban, I would have said the 10th. Why would I have said the 10th? Because that's when it was primarily being burnt. That's when the temple was primarily being destroyed. Began on the 9th, went into the 10th. So the comment on the side of it is a very interesting idea. The Sarat HaShas says over here on the side, is that you see from this, it's also based on a Mishnah Masechet Eduyot, this idea that a Beit Din later is not allowed to uproot a Beit Din earlier comes with a asterisk. It comes with a clause. What is that? Is that a later court is allowed to find a dat yachid that existed earlier, even though they don't paskin like that dat yachid, which means the majority paskin one way. In this case, Tisha B'Av was on the 9th of Av. There was Rabbi Yochanan, and there were others who said it should be the 10th, but they were overruled. But a later court has the ability to find a dat yachid and paskin like that dat yachid in a later generation, even though the earlier generations didn't paskin that way. That's not necessarily an issue of ein beit din yachol levatel beit din chavero, of a later court not being allowed to override an earlier court. It's very interesting. So it would come out, and we learn Mishnayot, for example, there's the Rabbim and there's the Yachid. Don't disregard the Yachid, because that Yachid essentially allows a later court to rely on them and overrule an earlier court that was the majority. And that's not a problem, even if they're not b'chokhmah of a minyan greater.
Wow.
Interesting halacha that would come out from this. Okay, we'll stop here. God willing, we'll pick up the top of Amud Aleph, Amud Bet tomorrow. We'll discuss Rebbi planting a tree on Purim. Have a great day, everybody.
Wow.